The history of Filipinos in America is a long and complex one. It is a history that is often overlooked. Filipinos were among the first Asians to arrive in what is now the United States. In 1587, Filipino sailors arrived in Morro Bay, California, aboard the Spanish galleon ship. This predates the arrival of the Pilgrims by several decades. Despite their early presence, Filipinos have faced centuries of discrimination and prejudice. The Spanish colonization of the Philippines in the 16th century had a profound impact on Filipino migration to the Americas. The Spanish often used Filipinos as sailors, laborers, and domestic servants throughout their vast empire. This led to the establishment of Filipino communities in places like Louisiana, Florida, and California. However, the arrival of the United States as a colonial power in the late 19th century marked a turning point in Filipino American history. The American victory in the Spanish-American War in 1898 led to the U.S. colonization of the Philippines. This colonization brought with it a new wave of Filipino immigration to the United States. Filipinos were initially welcomed as American nationals but were soon met with hostility and discrimination. They were seen as competitors for jobs and as a threat to American culture. The Page Act of 1875, which was originally intended to restrict the immigration of Chinese women, was also used to bar the entry of Filipino women. This law had a devastating impact on Filipino families, as it prevented many from reuniting in the United States. The subsequent Philippine-American War from 1899 to 1902 further strained relations between the two countries. The war resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Filipinos and solidified the U.S. position as a colonial power in the Pacific. The early 20th century witnessed the rise of scientific racism, a pseudo-scientific ideology that sought to justify racial hierarchy and discrimination. Filipinos, along with other people of color, were often subjected to dehumanizing treatment and were portrayed as primitive and savage. One of the most egregious examples of this was the display of Filipinos in human zoos. The 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, for instance, featured a Philippine exhibit that included a human zoo. Thousands of Filipinos, including indigenous peoples from the Igorot tribe, were brought to the United States and displayed in mock villages. Visitors would gawk at them, take photographs, and marvel at their supposed exoticism. This exhibition was not an isolated incident. Filipinos were also exhibited at the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco and other World's Fairs. These exhibitions reinforced racist stereotypes about Filipinos and other colonized peoples. They presented a distorted view of Filipino culture and further marginalized them in American society. The legacy of these human zoos is still felt today. The psychological impact of being put on display as exhibits had a profound and lasting effect on generations of Filipinos. It reinforced feelings of inferiority and otherness. The fight for recognition and respect continues to this day. The discrimination faced by Filipinos in the early 20th century was not limited to exhibitions and cultural prejudice. It was codified into law and manifested in acts of violence. Filipinos were denied basic rights and faced significant barriers to economic and social mobility. One of the most significant challenges Filipinos encountered was labor exploitation. Plantation owners in Hawaii and California actively recruited Filipinos as a source of cheap labor. They were often paid lower wages than their white counterparts and were subjected to harsh working conditions. The lack of legal protections made Filipinos vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. This exploitation led to labor unrest and contributed to the rise of Filipino labor movements in the United States. The resentment towards Filipinos, fueled by economic anxieties and racial prejudice, sometimes erupted into violence. The Watsonville riots of 1930, in which white mobs attacked Filipino farm workers, exemplified the extent of anti-Filipino sentiment. These riots resulted in the deaths of several Filipinos and highlighted the vulnerability of this immigrant community. In addition to labor exploitation and racial violence, Filipinos were also subject to anti-miscegenation laws. These laws, prevalent in many states, prohibited marriages between Filipinos and whites. This further marginalized Filipinos and prevented them from fully integrating into American society. It also created a climate of fear and distrust, as interracial relationships were criminalized. The outbreak of World War II brought about a complex and often contradictory chapter in Filipino American history. Filipinos in the United States, eager to prove their loyalty and patriotism, enlisted in the U.S. Armed Forces in large numbers. They served with distinction in various theaters of war, including the Pacific. The 1st Filipino Infantry Regiment, for instance, played a crucial role in the liberation of the Philippines from Japanese occupation. Despite their wartime service and sacrifices, Filipino veterans faced a bitter betrayal upon their return home. The 1946 Rescission Act stripped Filipino veterans of their promised benefits and recognition. This act retroactively revoked the promise of citizenship and veterans' benefits made to Filipinos who served in the U.S. military during the war. It was a shameful act that denied Filipino veterans the respect and recognition they deserved. The legacy of this discrimination continues to this day. Filipino Americans still face significant challenges, including economic inequality, healthcare disparities, and persistent stereotypes. The COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, exposed and exacerbated existing health inequities, with Filipino Americans experiencing disproportionately high rates of infection and mortality. Moreover, the rise of anti-Asian hate during the pandemic, fueled by xenophobic rhetoric and scapegoating, highlighted the ongoing vulnerability of Asian Americans, including Filipinos. The 2024 presidential election also saw a resurgence of nationalist sentiment and anti-immigrant rhetoric. This rhetoric, while not always explicitly directed at Filipinos, creates a climate of fear and uncertainty for many immigrant communities. It is imperative that we acknowledge and learn from this history. By understanding the struggles and contributions of Filipino Americans, we can work towards a more just and equitable future. Remembering this often forgotten history is not just about the past, it is about understanding the present and shaping a future where all Americans are treated with dignity and respect.